And this session is presented by Rajasthan Patrika series. It's Rajasthan Patrika series presented by Rajasthan Patrika. Let's welcome Anthony and Eugene on stage for another wonderful session.
Good.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is with such excitement and pleasure that I welcome you to the session with Anthony Sattin to explore his recent book, The Young Lawrence. My name is Eugene Rogan. I am a historian of the modern Middle East, and I'm one of Anthony's reviewers for this book. So I have eminent qualifications to be leading the conversation tonight.
And you probably guessed it was a good review.
Anthony brings to the study of Lawrence of Arabia his skills both as a historian and a travel writer, proven in a lifelong publication record with some particularly distinctive stars to his credit, such as his A Winter in the Nile, Florence Nightingale, Gustave Flaubert, and The Temptations of Egypt. The Pharaoh's Shadow, Travels in Ancient and Modern Egypt. And most recently, Lifting the Veil, 2 centuries of travelers, traders, and tourism in Egypt. But in this case, you've embarked on the biography of one person and one person alone. You begin with Thomas Edward Lawrence in Oxford, just at the very beginning of the First World War. And you picture the man sitting in a small shed at the end of his garden in Oxford, burning the pages of a manuscript enticingly entitled The 7 Pillars of Wisdom. Now, your mission was to resurrect this juvenile work, rather like a phoenix, to make it rise again from the ashes of the little wood stove at the bottom of the garden. And in so doing, you've carved a niche for yourself in what I call the Lawrence industry. There are so many books published about T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, not least in recent years when, with the centenary of the Arab Revolt coming, we've seen a whole new energy given. But in this case, the young T.E.L., before the Arab Revolt. Now, aside from the space that Jeremy Wilson's devoted to the subject in his authorized biography, relatively little has been written about Lawrence's early life before the First World War. And I would argue you have a great deal to add to what we get from the authorized biography and Jeremy Wilson's excellent work. There's so much more to be said on this subject. So, like your book, I'd like to frame our conversation today around distinct phases of the youth and young manhood of T.E. Lawrence. And I'd like to begin with his childhood, which wasn't always in Oxford.
No, he was born in Wales. I've given a lot of talks about this book in the last year, and I gave one in Wales, which was great because I was able to call him Welsh. I was also able to call him Irish, and I was able to call him Scottish, because he has a claim to that as well, and English. But he was born in Wales, and his family moved around a lot in his early life. And it's not he was born in 1888, and it's not till he's 10 or 12 that they finally settle in Oxford, aware that there are 5 sons by then, and he's the second of them, and that they need to educate their children. So his parents are sort of moving around, and not staying in large places. They tended to sort of, in England, they lived in the New Forest, for instance, out of town. Before that, they lived in France, in Normandy, in Brittany, rather. Again, sort of not in town. They were avoiding people. And that's a sort of clue to
well, yeah, precisely, because it wasn't because Lawrence's father was a traveling salesman. They're fleeing a terrible secret.
That's
and
right.
Lawrence might himself be party to more than his parents would want him to know. What is the terrible secret of Lawrence's childhood?
Well, soon after he arrived in Oxford, sometime in his teens, he worked out, and as I said, he was the second of 5 sons. He alone seemed to have worked out there was something wrong with his parents' marriage. And it's a wonder that it took him so long to work it out. But he decided he was illegitimate. But imagine being brought up in a house where there is no family background. There are no pictures of the grandparents. There's no story of we Lawrences come from wherever it is. He was never told this. And the reason was, so he decided he was illegitimate, that his mother was his mother, but his father was not his father, and that but this man who he called father had stepped in to do the decent thing. And it colours his whole upbringing. But it is extraordinary, given, I mean, there are no family portraits hanging on the wall, there are no relatives come to call, it's just a sort of, there's no sense of who we Lawrences are. So they're brought up in Oxford, and again, even in Oxford, his father never works, but they don't take part in the social life of the city. They go to church, that's it.
But illegitimacy was such a stigma in the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah, well, and the truth, which he doesn't find out until 1919, is even more extraordinary than he imagined, and that was that his father, they weren't even called Lawrence. His father was called Sir Thomas Chapman, and was an Irish aristocrat, landlord, had a huge estate, was married, had a couple of daughters, and a governess came into the house, and he had an affair, Sir Thomas had an affair with the governess, and she got pregnant, and he moved her into rooms in Dublin, and was spotted in the street one day by a family friend who told Lady Chapman that there was obviously something wrong, something untoward was going on. And so Lady Chapman forced her husband into choosing between her or the governess, and he chose the governess. So they went off and had the first of the 5 sons. But because Lady Chapman was a God-fearing Catholic, there could never be a divorce. So he was never able to get married. So he changed his name to Lawrence. Now the governess was herself illegitimate, and she didn't know her father, but Lawrence may well have been the name of one of her parents. And so there's no sort of backstory to her either. And Sir Thomas, as I said, never tells his children about the fact that he was called Chapman, and there's this whole Irish family that they have. He writes it in a letter to be read after his death. And it's a terrible confession about, oh, my sons, I have sinned. I should have known there would never be a divorce. I've had to carry this burden all my life. So Lawrence, Ned, as he was called in the family, the second son, is brought up, and he was clearly a very sensitive man, young man, and he was brought up with this huge secret, this great tension. His brothers seem not to have noticed. None of them admit to any sort of prior knowledge of this, but it's only Ned, and he tells a friend in his teenage years that this is what he believes, that he's illegitimate. And in that case, yes, it's a huge stigma. And for instance, when he gets to Oxford, which he does, to the university, there's a sense that he couldn't take up a post as an academic if he wanted to, because if somebody found out that he was illegitimate, he probably would be thrown out. I mean, it really had a bite to it 100 years ago.
And do you think this explains Lawrence the loner? I mean, somebody who had been brought up trying to flee society takes to places where he's able to live in a very small community, and people who may not be probing his family background. Is this part of the foundation of the character?
It's certainly why they move around a lot, the parents, before, in his early life. And it's also why he retreats into his imagination. His brothers, I mean, one of the things I've tried to do in this book, the thing about Lawrence is that everything that happens during the war and after the war has been mythologized. Right. There is no one account, or no one sort of agreement on anything to do with his life. For instance, everybody, if you know anything about him, you'll know that he fought with the Arabs during the Arab Revolt. But his account and the Arab account of his involvement don't agree at all. Faisal, the leader of the Arab Revolt, in his journals, Lawrence isn't even mentioned in most of the key moments. But you go back to his earlier life, and it is possible to say something definite about him. And for instance, he clearly was unlike his brothers. And when they were growing up, the stories they grew up with were stories that Ned told all the brothers. And they were stories about Crusader knights. They were stories about attacking castles. They were stories out of the Arthurian legends and that sort of. That was what captured his imagination. And he found He was a brass rubber, for instance.
Well, exactly.
Does everybody know what brass rubbing is? I mean, it's noblemen, particularly during the Crusader period, when your body was brought home, you would have a brass image of yourself laid over your tomb, and using wax paper and a colour, brass rubbers could make an exact impression of it. Now, these are life-size portraits of crusading knights. That was what hung in Lawrence's bedroom when he grew up. Not family portraits, but Crusader knights. And the man was not like everybody else. He was really, really different.
Well, even the boy wasn't like everyone else. And that fascination with medievaldom and crusaders and knights in shining armor also went into a kind of antiquarian interest. You describe the young Lawrence running around like a street urchin, collecting interesting bits of shards and old coins and things from parts of ancient Oxford being dug up for foundations, and sort of running with that off to the Ashmolean Museum. And this seems to bring together so many things of what are going to be dominant features of his later life. The link to archaeology, the link to the Ashmolean.
He became the youngest donor of antiques to the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. And he did it by collecting together. So there was a lot of reconstruction going on in Oxford when he was from about 14 to 17, 3 years. They dug up roads, they pulled down old buildings. And he paid the workmen to give him shards of pots or a bit of a glass bottle or whatever. And he put together from there, he would take it all home and piece it together. And he put together a small collection of medieval pots and Elizabethan glass bottles that he then donated to the museum. And then, by the time he was about 18, he was helping them reorganize their medieval collection. He had become something of an expert. And that relationship with the museum became incredibly important in developing, well, in his life.
No, it's quite extraordinary, too. You won't find high school children today being admitted to the galleries of the Ashmolean with the kind of donor respect that Lawrence clearly enjoyed. So, I mean, I think all of these things feature in what become dominant parts of his character later on. And one more from this early period is he seemed to have wanted to push his body beyond its natural limits as soon as he learned how to ride a bicycle.
Yes. Now, I'm sure if you know anything about him, you saw the film Lawrence of Arabia. Can I make that assumption? Has anybody read Seven Pillars of Wisdom? To the end? Okay. Anyway, unlike Peter O'Toole, who was very tall and commanding, Lawrence was very short. And even with this, it's impossible quite to tie down exactly how short he was, because he had 3 different army records, because he was enlisted 3 different times under 3 different names, and the medical reports don't agree. So he was certainly at least 5'3.5", and he was certainly not more than 5'5.5". And even he admitted the 5'5.5" bit, because in a description he wrote of being recruited into the Air Force in 1923, he describes the recruiting medical officers telling him to make himself as large as he can to hit the 5'6" threshold. So on tiptoes, he could get to 5'6". So he was a short man, and his brothers, for instance, weren't. So he was much shorter than, and that forms part of his character. He broke his leg apparently in a school fight at Oxford High School. Supposedly, according to the legend, defending a young boy who was being picked on. He stepped in, he got his leg broken. And his mother said that's why he never grew. But what it does do, and
don't break your legs.
whatever the reason for it, it forces him to become tough. If he's not going to be taller than anybody else, he's certainly going to be able to stand up for himself. And he mortifies the flesh. He became a vegetarian sometime around 15, 16. But there's a summer, I think, when he's about 18, 19, where he'd been cycling all over England, but there's a summer where he decides he's going to cycle down through France. And I calculated that over 7 weeks, he averaged 50 miles a day, every day. This
is before 21-speed bicycles and comfortable seats.
Yeah,
I want you to imagine this.
Or chamois leather, chamois lined shorts or anything else. And he had, he would drink 2 pints of milk for breakfast, have some fruit, a bit of bread, and that was it. He'd have a bit of fruit during the day, and one proper meal at the end of the day. And you think, why is he doing this? And it's to make himself tough. And he did it in the summer. You know, it's very, very hot.
And he's touring castles all the way. I mean, it's still his love of medieval...
Yeah, yes, and the point of doing that was, because by then he was studying medieval history at Oxford, and the point was, he wasn't on a cycling holiday, he was doing research for his thesis on medieval castles. So, in fact, most of the day he was mapping and photographing castles in France. So the cycling bit was just to get there from A to B. But just the determination, I mean, I've done a lot of long-distance cycling myself, but you know, the idea of doing that for 7 weeks, you know, is just withering. And he doesn't boast about it. You know, his letters back home, that he reveals very, very little about the physical effort of doing that. It's all about how beautiful Chartres Cathedral is, for instance, or, you know, or how wonderful the battlements are on Giscourt Castle. There's never any mention about the difficulty or how many punctures he's got or whatever else. So.
Well, that's what mortification of the flesh is about. It's about an inner seeking for some greater strength and forcing your body to its limits. And now here we have Lawrence, man and boy in Oxford. He goes from school in Oxford to university in Oxford, and many of the sort of fascinations that had driven him as a schoolboy are still driving him in university. As you said, he's touring castles on bicycle as a university student, and it plays very directly to both what he's studying at Oxford and what he wants to write his thesis on.
Yes, I mean, the idea of doing a thesis was quite new for undergraduates at Oxford. But he decided that he was going to do it it was going to be medieval architecture. But then through his connections at the Ashmolean, it was suggested that he should look at whether medieval castle builders, the people who built those grand castles in Europe, took that skill to the Middle East and built all those castles in the Middle East that we're seeing in the news these days, like Crac de Chevalier, for instance, and for instance the castle at Palmyra, or whether it was because of the Crusades that knowledge came back to Europe. I mean, it's quite a sort of narrow, sort of sort of boffin-like
for an undergraduate thesis, though.
For an undergraduate thesis. And so he's directly taking on the accepted knowledge of his tutor at Oxford, who'd written who was the great expert, but had never been to the Middle East. And so, sorry.
No, finish your point.
So at the end of that cycle, well, halfway through that cycle ride down to the south of France, at the end of his first year at Oxford, he got down to somewhere near the Mediterranean. He wasn't sure exactly how far from the Mediterranean he was. And there's a great moment where he's standing on a hillside and he's looking out over the, sort of the olive groves, and then beyond that the vineyards, and then in the back it's sort of all hazy and grey and whatever. And then the sun came out, because it was a sort of dog day afternoon in August, and the sun came out, and he realized what he was looking at was the Mediterranean. It was the first time he'd seen the Mediterranean. And we who fly around the world all the time, it's sort of it's nothing. But for him, this was a really big moment. And he quoted Shelley. I mean, this is just to say that he's not a normal person. First time I saw the Mediterranean, I went yippee and threw myself into it. He quotes Shelley and said, he said, I love all waste and solitary places where we taste the pleasure of believing what we see is boundless, as we wish our souls to be. And there's a sense of a yearning in this young man for some sense of escape. And he wrote home that night saying, I felt at last I'd reached the way to the south and all the glorious east. Greece, Carthage, Egypt, Tyre, Syria, there's a long, long list. They were all there, all in front of me. I fancy I now know better than Keats what Cortez felt like silent upon a peak in Darien. I must get down here, further out again. Really, this getting to the sea has almost overturned my mental balance. I would accept a passage for Greece tomorrow. And I love the idea that accepting a passage to Greece might be a sign of insanity. Whereas, in fact, what he did was he turned his bike around and he cycled back to Oxford, which, in my mind, is much more of a sign of insanity. But anyway.
It has its charms, though, Anthony. It has its charms. No more of that from the Cambridge people. But when he goes off to the Levant in pursuit of his research for the thesis, he can't take his bicycle with him. He has an alternate mode of transportation in mind. And it's something that his supervisors and the great travelers of his age were consulted on and tried to discourage.
Yes, well, he decided he was going to walk through the Middle East, looking at Crusader castles. And he consulted the great expert on Arabian matters, a man called Charles Doughty, who wrote a book called Travels in Arabia. And Doughty said, if I were you, I wouldn't do it. I certainly wouldn't walk, because they will, the people in the Middle East will regard you as easy prey, 5 foot, whatever he was, blonde hair, blue eyes, looking incredibly young and innocent. So Doughty said, you just have to do what everybody else does. You go with assistants, you go with horsemen, camels, or whatever you want. You go with baggage carriers and guards. And Lawrence said, no, I'm going to walk. So he had a bespoke suit made for himself, which had extra pockets in it. And he took one spare shirt and a pair of hobnail boots. In a very little backpack, he had a camera and a pistol. And a notebook. That's how he went to the Middle East for a summer. And he arrived in July. There's a man from Oxford. I mean, this again is sort of, it's not normal.
No. Mad dogs and Englishmen.
It's not what people did.
Yeah.
But it's wonderful, because it was just before his 21st birthday. And you could feel the excitement of being a young man with a real adventure ahead of him. And, it's captivating, his description of walking down the road. He walks out of Beirut. And he told his parents that he was going to go with a team from what's now the American University in Beirut, which was then the American college, and that tutors would take him on a walk somewhere around Beirut. And that was what he told his parents he was going to do. But he sets off for the Sea of Galilee from out of Beirut, which, if you have any sense of the Middle East, is a really extraordinary journey to make. And he goes on foot. And there's no hotel. He doesn't have a tent, he doesn't have a bearer, he hasn't got any food.
He doesn't really have the money to pay for hotels.
No,
he's going on the cheap, too.
Yeah, he's going on the cheap. So he relies, and this is absolutely key in everything that happens afterwards, and what makes him able to do what he does during the war, and makes him stand out from almost everybody else on the British side of the First World War, that he's obliged to deal with the natives.
Yeah.
That unlike everybody else who travelled sort of with tents and with people who'd look after them, every day he had to go into a village and ask if he could sleep in someone's house, and every day he was given hospitality, and which is extraordinary.
Yeah.
Sometimes it was a sort of big spread. Sometimes it would just be bread and milk or whatever. Sometimes he was given a bed. Sometimes he was just shown to the
I'd like to bring you into the story here, because as a traveler and a travel writer, you've covered a lot of the same territory that Lawrence crossed. I mean, can you relate to this aspect of Lawrence as a traveler and someone who clearly has a passion for that part of the world yourself? You put yourself into the picture for a moment.
All right. Yes, I have. One of the really fun things about this book was traveling from, I traveled in his footsteps. The furthest Lawrence got on that walk was up to what's now almost the Turkish-Syrian border. So I started, obviously I didn't go into Syria because it's 2013, but I had, half my lifetime ago, which was when I first came across this story of Lawrence's Crusader castles. It was his thesis. I was traveling from Aleppo to Damascus. And someone had said to me, you must go and look at these Crusader castles, they're extraordinary. And so I made that journey then, which is, I think, 1989. And there wasn't a lot of tourism in Syria in 1989. There wasn't such a thing as a tourist visa at the time. So I'd gone in as a journalist, but I'd slipped my minder quite by accident, because they stamped my passport on arrival with a thing that said, must report to the Ministry of Interior within 24 hours. But it was smudged, so I didn't read it, so I couldn't report to the ministry. And everybody I met on that trip said to me, are you alone? And I said, yeah. And they said, oh. And I'd say, is that unusual? And they say, yes. In the end, I rented a car in Aleppo, and I drove. I wasn't going to walk.
You only relate so far.
I know, but it was winter. It wasn't summer. And I drove through the mountains in the snow, and I slept, in castles and things, and it was absolutely beautiful. There was nobody else there. These extraordinary structures.
Did you ever knock on someone's door and ask if you could stay the night?
No, but for instance, in one little cafe in a village somewhere near El Kaf, which is really in the remote, that used to be an assassin stronghold, you know, long in the time of the Crusaders. I was sitting in a little cafe and they'd sort of had a bit of food, and when I asked for the bill, the owner said, "It's been taken care of."
Right.
You know, we can't have you having to pay for your food in this place. And I experienced a lot of that there, which is absolutely charming.
I'm sure you'll agree, it's something that breaks my heart as I watch the tragedy of Syrian refugees in Europe today, knowing that when we've traveled across their lands, everyone received us as though we were honored, treasured guests. And to see them being received today in the cities of Europe with such indifference and such coldness must seem to them like the sign that Europe is the most uncivilized continent God ever neglected.
It's true.
Thank you. So it's not surprising, given the way he's grown up, given his passions, given his travel experiences, that finishing his studies at Oxford, the man would get into archaeology, and that his archaeology would take him back to the Near East. Could you tell us a little bit about the Carchemish adventure and how Lawrence gets there?
Yes, well, there's a man called David Hogarth who's sort of one of the shadowy figures in the British establishment at this period. And what's really curious, because I thought I was going to bring this man out. There's never been a biography of him. But he's a fascinating character because he had been a journalist for the Times, and then he'd become an archaeologist. At a time, this is a time when, beginning of the 20th century, and archaeology is really just beginning to become a science. Flinders Petrie has got the chair at University College London and is trying to sort of apply methodology to digging things up rather than just, I think there's a bit of treasure there, yeah. And Hogarth had become head of the British School at Athens and had done a lot of digs there and written books and written travel books and given lectures to big audiences and you know, he was a notable figure. And then he became director of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and he does that. He's there till the end of his life. And then during the First World War, he becomes the head of the Arab Bureau in Cairo, which is from which all British policy is sort of comes out of this bureau that Lawrence himself and Gertrude Bell and many others are part of. And then after the war, he carries on at the museum, but he's also president of the Royal Geographical Society. There is not an archive for this man. When I asked at the museum, they said, well, he appears to have been a very private man. I'm sorry. You know, he was a public figure. And Churchill said of him that it was unhealthy that so much power should be held by a man who has no official position. And all I can assume is that in 50 years' time, someone will unlock the box, or that it was weeded. But there was a PhD which I spent months getting to see, and it was sitting in the library at the Ashmolean, but they insisted they didn't have it. And in the end, I tracked down the author who's left academia and who's running a cafe in the States. And I said to her, that you must have a copy of your thesis on Hogarth, and she said, no, I don't, but there is definitely one in the library, and this is who you have to speak to, and tell them I told.
Conspiracy
theories. They sit around Lawrence, and even the people connect. Anyway, Hogarth is the man, becomes Lawrence's father figure, and everything in Lawrence's life is sort of stimulated or started by Hogarth. So, for instance, what happens in the war is because Hogarth gets him that job.
For sure.
And
but he gets him into archaeology.
And he gets him
before he gets him into intelligence.
Exactly, because the British Museum asked Hogarth if he would go and dig at Carchemish, which is a site literally now divided between the Turkish and the Syrian border. So half of it, happily the exciting part sits in Turkey, and the other part sits across the border in Syria. And it was a Hittite stronghold, and it sits right on the Euphrates River. So it's a huge mound. It's about 100 meters high, absolutely massive. And had not been dug. Well, a few people had sort of tried a bit of treasure looting, and Hogarth thought, because it sat on the frontier of the Hittite and the Assyrian and the Egyptian empires in antiquity. And the Hittites were sort of the lost people of the ancient world because their language had not been deciphered. And Hogarth thought maybe if they dug in this great city, Hittite city, that they would find something like the Rosetta Stone that would allow them have the same inscription in 2 or 3 different languages, would allow them to decipher this script. And I'm not giving anything away in the book that say they didn't find it.
But it's such Indiana Jones stuff.
Yeah, it really is.
You know, find the lost language of the lost people.
No, and again, think about how lucky this man was. He was, 23, 22 when he went out to Carchemish. And he effectively went out as an intern. He wasn't being paid. I mean, they paid his expenses, but he didn't get a fee. But he had no training. He was a medieval historian. And within a couple of months, he was effectively running the dig because he was the only one of the 3 Brits who spoke any Arabic. And he had this way with people, which he had learned from that walk he made. He understood how to treat the people. So he had 200 people under him. He was the only one who had a camera or who knew how to develop film. So he was also doing that. And effectively, he ran this dig, and he ran it from 1910 to 1914.
It's a very exciting dig, and he created this. One of the things I really enjoyed reading in the book was the lengths to which he went in making the dig house a home and decorating it with, antiques and things he was buying in Damascus and all. And this became a real stopping point for travelers and influential people who were kind of on the grand tour. They would go to Carchemish to go see what had been found and meet with the Britons digging there. So some of them were very influential people he would wind up working with later on.
That's right. Well, and some of them were, Gertrude Bell was the first.
I was dropping hints.
Was the first visitor on the first season, before they'd built the house. And she was rather a grand lady. She published books. She was a known figure, and she arrived with her entire entourage. But there was this sort of rivalry between Britain and Germany in archaeology, as in everything else, for influence in that part of the world. And in fact, the British had hoped to get a much more important dig for the Hittites in the middle of Anatolia. That the German Sultan had personally intervened. The German Kaiser had personally intervened with the Sultan in Istanbul to make sure that the Germans got it, not the British. So the British got Carchemish as a sort of second choice, second best thing. And Gertrude Bell had been to see the Germans just before she turns up to see Lawrence and a man called Reginald Campbell Thompson, who were the only 2 Brits at the dig when she arrived. And in her journal, which is fantastic, I'm so happy that Lawrence never read that, because he would be mortified, because she was clearly very, very taken with the German who was running the German dig, and she talks about how handsome he is and how efficient his dig is, and how interesting all the things he'd found. And there's a sort of very brief entry for Carchemish about she supposes they found everything there is to be found, which it wasn't all true, because the dig is still going on today. But she does say that there is this young man called Lawrence, and that one day he will make a traveller. That's her view of him.
And did he travel?
He did.
You were speaking about Lawrence's ability to talk to people. Yet Arabic is not something he ever formally studied, at least not until he got to the region. So what was the state of Lawrence's Arabic, this man who's going to be known as Lawrence of Arabia?
Well, it's really interesting, because when he was first sent out to Carchemish, because he didn't have a job and he didn't have anything else to do, Hogarth suggested that he should go ahead and maybe learn a bit of Arabic. That might be helpful on the way. And I presume he'd picked up a bit when he was doing his walk. So he went to Lebanon, to Jebel, or Byblos, as it was called, where there was an American school. And there was a local woman called Farida Al-Aql. The Al-Aql family is still there in Byblos. And she taught him Arabic. And he had a couple of months, 2 or 3 months then. And he would go back on a regular basis over the next 4 years to Byblos, sometimes just for the pleasure in the summer, because the dig would only go on for 3 or 4 months a year. And the other archaeologists would go back to London, but Lawrence stayed out, because this was his home. He'd built a house for himself, literally built a house for himself. And so sometimes in the summer he would go on a journey, and one summer he spent in Byblos improving his Arabic. But Farida Al-Aql said after the war that he was never fluent.
Right.
And that's really interesting, because then you wonder, well, how much did he know of what was being planned for the Arab revolt? How much could he have understood of the conversations around him?
I mean, I have no doubt that in the time he spent traveling with Bedouin, day and night, for weeks, he would have had the kind of immersion course that would have given him really quite a good command of Bedouin dialect. But for all of those of you who speak Arabic in the audience, you'll appreciate just how much fun the Hijazi Arabs must have made of this guy coming with an Eastern Mediterranean Arabic dialect like Lebanese, Byblos. They must have just thought he was the most effete little creature that white skin ever brought to Arabia.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, beyond learning Arabic, I came away from your book really struck by how this was a moment where if ever he fell in love, Lawrence fell in love in Carchemish. And it seems to be a love that was truly a love for his life, you know, and quite an enduring love. There's been so much fascination and speculation about his sexuality, his presumed homosexuality. I'd like to hear what you have to say about Lawrence in Love and how this came about.
Well, if you Google the name Dahoum, D-A-H-O-U-M, there's all sorts of gay websites devoted to this relationship. There was a young boy. He was maybe 14 or 15 when Lawrence first met him, called Dahoum, and he was the most junior of the 200 working on this site. And Lawrence recognized something in this young man, and not just his physical beauty, because he was quite striking, and he was quite tall as well. And he was from this village, Jarablus, which sat beside the Hittite dig. So he was a donkey boy. He had a donkey. He would bring water to the diggers, to the excavators, this team of 200. And something about him caught Lawrence's eye. And it seems to have been the fact that of all the 200, he was the only one who had taught himself to read or write any Arabic at all. Mm-hmm. And when Lawrence asked him what he was going to do with the money that he was earning from the dig, because most people in that part of the world didn't earn cash. When you worked for barter. You gave your labor in return for food or whatever. The British Museum was paying cash, so it was a very prestigious job to have. And Dahoum said that when the dig was finished, he was going to take himself off to Aleppo and get himself an education. And so Lawrence thought going to Aleppo would be a really bad idea for this village boy. So instead that he would educate him. And not with the Christian missionaries, not in an imperialistic way. It would have to be an Arab education. He didn't want him to convert, and Lawrence sort of had sort of not enjoyed his meetings with what he calls the sort of half-westernized Arabs that he'd met, particularly in Lebanon. He thought they'd lost something of themselves by acquiring a Western education. So he wanted him to be as much of an Arab as he could, and I think this is very, very much a part of what he wanted for the Arabs during the Arab Revolt as well, and why he got involved. The last page of 7 Pillars of Wisdom, which was not to be published during his lifetime, says his greatest motive for everything he did was personal. And I think it was, in some way, Dahoum came to represent for him the potential of the Arabs. And at the beginning of the 20th century, the Arabs were, they didn't have much of a sense of if you sat in on our discussion of the peace to end all peace, the First World War in the Middle East, you'll know there was not much of a sense of Arab identity in the Ottoman Empire, and certainly not in somewhere like Carchemish in 1910, 1912. And so, but Lawrence thought that these people had been really great, really powerful, really the height of Arab culture had been one of the great lights in the world, and he wanted them to be that again. And he he thought Dahoum would be an example of that. And so in the 4 years that he knows Dahoum goes from being the most junior to one of the 4 most senior members of this thing, with no education apart from what Lawrence can teach him. He can read and write English by the end of it, because he's keeping the inventory. He can use a camera, he can make sketches. He's welcome at the British consulate in Aleppo, where he sits in at teas and things like that. He goes to Oxford with Lawrence in the summer of 1913, at the end of which, there's 2 of them that go from the village, at the end of which they're asked, if you could take one thing home from Oxford to Syria, what would you take? And one of them says, I'd like to take the hot water tap, and I want to stick it on my wall, so that when I'm at home, I'll be able to get hot water whenever I want. And the other says, I want to take the keep off the grass sign from Oxford Park, because it seems to have some magical property. Nobody can walk past it. That's good. So Lawrence sees in this man a great potential, and he helps him fulfill it. And in the process of that, they do clearly fall in love. But there's something that we have it straight from Dahum, actually. I'll just read you this, this bit, if I can find it, where Dahum was asked, no, I'm probably not going to be able to find it, why
the Arabs loved
why
Lawrence.
the Arabs loved Lawrence. Yeah. And he says, we love him because whatever we can do, he can do better than us. And also because he lives like us, because he shares our hardships, and because he loves us. And there's that sense of, it's such an open and honest and extraordinary comment for someone to make, especially at the beginning of the 20th century. It seems, now, the 21st century, okay, but in very conservative, very traditional Syria at the beginning of the 20th century, it seems a very, very extraordinary, outbreak of emotion. So there was clearly a love between these two men. But there's also been a suggestion of a physical relationship between them. And I've had long conversations with journalists who I could just see the headlines, But I didn't find any dirty sheets. I didn't find anybody who thought, although several people insinuated, but then immediately who knew him, insinuated that it was rather an odd relationship, what was going on between the two of them. But then when pushed to it, always said, no, I'm not for a minute suggesting that he was gay. But after the war, one of Lawrence's great friends was the novelist E.M. Foster, who was openly gay. And Foster tried very hard to draw Lawrence out. And they had a lot of conversations about it. And in the end, Foster decided that Lawrence was sexless. That Lawrence had said to him, the idea of sex with anybody, is just so disgusting that he just couldn't bear it. And he was known for not even enjoying shaking hands with people. I mean, so I think there was not a physical relationship between these two people, much to the disappointment of my editor, who thought he might have sold a few more copies. But I think it's a platonic love in the Greek ideal of it between men, which is not physical, but still is love. And maybe if it happened today, it would have been a physical relationship, because they certainly were attracted to each other. But it just did not happen then.
No, I find that such a persuasive analysis, and I think that we have a tendency to take the sexuality of the 21st century and assume it has always been so. And I think that in earlier times that people might have been far more hesitant to act on sexual impulse through shame or loathing of one's body or associations with sex as being disgusting, like that we can't relate to now.
Yeah, well, I also think, for somebody of Lawrence's position, I mean, when would you expect to lose your virginity in 1910s as a young man? Well, if you didn't do it with one of the staff, and they didn't have staff that were, then probably not until you were somewhere in your mid-20s when you got married or whatever. And that was Lawrence. He was 26 when the war started.
Now, I want to leave time for this audience to ask what I suspect are going to be many questions. And before we wrap, could you just give us very briefly the mission to map Palestine that follows archaeology? Because we really seem almost a predestined drive towards what he winds up doing in the war, in the different jobs he's holding and the different people he meets. And mapping Palestine was part of that. How did the archaeologist become a cartographer?
Well, there's everything with Lawrence has now become a conspiracy theory. So, for instance, the idea that he was sent to Carchemish, right beside the Euphrates, which was exactly where the Germans who were building the Berlin to Baghdad railway were going to cross the Euphrates. It goes right beside the dig. So there's an assumption that that was a spying mission, that he was sent out to report on progress on that. And I disprove that completely in the book. But clearly, in the beginning of 1914, Lawrence and Leonard Woolley, who was working on the dig at the time, were asked if they would go down into Palestine, into what's now Sinai Negev Desert, that bit just over the border from Palestine into what's now Egypt, and provide an archaeological cover for the Royal Engineers who needed to map it. And the background to that is that Lord Kitchener was effectively running Egypt. He was the British agent in Cairo. And he knew there was a war coming. This was January 1914. He knew there was a war coming, and he knew, because he had been part of the Royal Engineers mission that had surveyed Sinai in the 1880s, that there was one bit they'd missed. And he also knew that when the war did come, it would be Britain against Turkey, and the Turks would go for the Suez Canal, and that bit of the desert would be where the Turkish army would try and cross to cut off the Suez Canal and cut the passage to India. And so Kitchener needed this map, but this was Turkish territory, and he didn't feel that he could ask Turks for permission for the Royal Engineers to map the desert, knowing that there was a war about to happen. So he decided instead that they would put forward this pretext of the Palestine Exploration Fund, applying for permission to look for the traces of the children of Israel in that part of the desert. Now, the passage of the children of Israel is still somewhat sort of contentious anyway, but they certainly weren't there. They definitely were never there. So Lawrence and Woolley go down with some Royal Engineers who do the map. And Lawrence says, we are a red herring. We're just providing cover for these people. But during this, something really interesting happens. Two really interesting things happen. One is that he and Dahum get lost and in the desert, and they are looking for the people, their team and their luggage and everything else. And lots of people are looking for them, including Ottoman police and others, and they don't find each other. And Lawrence says it's amazing how easy it is to lose yourself in the desert. And in the light of what happens 3 years later during the Arab Revolt, where Lawrence says, suppose we could be, as we were, a vapor. He understood, you could just come out of the desert, attack the Turks, and disappear again, and they'll never find you. And that was the whole basis for his plan for the Arab Revolt. So that's one thing. And then at the end of it, he and Dahum go down to Aqaba. And now Lawrence is famous for 1917, when nobody expected it. He and an Arab force come and attack Aqaba from the back. And he knew, because he had been there in 1914, that all of the defenses in Aqaba were facing the Red Sea. And so you come out of the desert and all their guns are facing the wrong way. So that's number two. And number three, he had to take the Hejaz Railway back to Damascus on his way back to Carchemish. And you just wonder, the Hejaz Railway, terribly romantic. I've been on it. In Syria, they revived a little section with a steam engine. It's incredibly slow and incredibly smelly and miserable. I went with a group of people, almost all of whom after 10 minutes said, "Can we get out now?" Because it's so, steam engines are not glamorous. But he understood the terrain. He understood the land that he was going.
He rode it for hours, and after hours, anybody would be thinking of ways to blow this damn thing up.
Yeah, exactly.
So he got to act on that fantasy.
Yes.
Well, I think we've covered the phases that were really the defining features of what might have gone into this very first attempt to write a book called The 7 Pillars of Wisdom. So I'd like to as we bring this to a close, bring you back to where we started. If your book was an attempt to give us what might have been the content of this now burned book, what do you think he wrote in it? If you were to give a wild guess that made him feel that it would be better to burn it than leave it should he die in war.
Yeah, well, I should say you'll have to buy the book to find out. But it's not on sale here, I don't think. So I'll tell you. When I mentioned that in 1989 I'd made that journey through the Crusader castles, and I first came across the idea. I had the idea for this story, and unlike you, Eugene, I'm not a professor at a university. I'm a storyteller, and although I found it fascinating, everything I knew about Lawrence, it wasn't until I came across this detail that he had written a manuscript and he'd burnt it in August 1914, just before he went off to war. And I thought, now that is a story, and that's a story I can tell. Why would you do it? I mean, anybody who's written a book knows it doesn't come easy. No. It requires a lot of effort. It was a full manuscript. It's the only thing, along with when he left Carchemish in summer 1914, he didn't know he wasn't going back. So he left everything except for the manuscript and the portrait of Dahum that he had, a sketch that had been made of Dahum. That's what he took home with him. And so this is something that is terribly important to him, this manuscript. And then the war happened, and he realized he wasn't going back to Carchemish, and he was tidying up his affairs. And I thought, now, what is he trying to hide? Now, he referred to this book after the war, when he mentioned that when the 7 Pillars of Wisdom that we have came out, and he said, before the war, I used this same title for my adventures in the region, and he dismissed it. He said, I burnt it because it was immature. Well, he didn't burn anything else, and there's lots of other immature things that survive. So I rule that out. And I think it comes down to the fact that he didn't want his mother to know what he had been up to in the Middle East. He must have described some of his relations or some of his adventures with Dahomey, because he traveled in the summers with Dahomey. They went visiting, they went buying Hittite seals, they went looking at castles. They traveled together a lot. And I think his mother would have smelt some rat there. And it's also that she would have been deeply offended by the fact that was acknowledged by his youngest brother who survived the war, who said that this was the only time that Lawrence was happy in his entire life, this period of Carchemish. And the first talk I ever gave was at a conference at Oxford, and I hadn't realized it was an academic conference. So there was all these sort of academic papers that were being given. And so I just submitted my title, which was called Finding Happiness. And it looked a bit lame, and they shoved it on the end as the last paper. It was all these there'd been a paper about the influence of Thomas Hardy's writing style on Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom and things like that. And so here was this thing about finding happiness. But you know, it's that. And I think there was that sense of this young man coming out, and not in the gay sense of the term, but finding love, finding himself, and away from his mother. I think it was simply that he didn't want her to know.
Anthony, thank you so much. But no, I'm going to stop you here only because
we're running out of time.
I've gone 3 minutes beyond what I, by firm discipline, said I would do.
Okay.
And I want to leave you time for questions. And I can see the microphones are here. And would you like me to choose the... Very good. So if I can see a show of hands, I see a gentleman right there in the 4th row, right bang in the middle, most inconvenient to reach.
Used by the Imperials, romanticized after his death. Would that sum up Lawrence's life?
Yes, I think so. He thought he was going to outsmart the Imperial project. It's impossible to know at exactly what point he knew about the Sykes-Picot Agreement, but I believe that he entered the Arab Revolt really believing that he could win freedom for independence for Arabs in the entirety of the Arab states. And as soon as he arrived in Cairo in 1916, he wrote this extraordinary letter to Hogarth saying, you've got to tell Churchill that rather than the Dardanelles, we have to move up to take Alexandretta, because that will not only allow the Arabs to occupy their own territory, but it'll stop the French getting anything. I mean, he was absolutely adamant from the beginning that neither Britain nor France should have anything to do. But at the end of the war, he ends up, and after the conferences and he did as much as he could, and the establishment of Faisal as king of Iraq and Abdullah as the future king of the Hashemite kingdom, Jordan, was as far as he could, as much as he could achieve. But he said at the end, it's a terrible thing to realize that you're just not good enough. That's how he felt about himself, which is why at the end of it, 1923, when he leaves Churchill and the colonial service, he says, Churchill said, you can do whatever you want to do, let me know and I can arrange it. And Lawrence said, I want to disappear. And he changed his name, he was a colonel, and re-enlist as a private in the Air Force. He wanted literally to disappear. He thought he'd been a complete failure. And the more he became famous, the more he wanted to disappear.
Okay, we're going to be short and sharp because there's a lot of hands here. And I got a gentleman right back there. And anybody in the very far back who wants to ask a question, I favor the back. So let me see your hands. Please.
Hello, sir. I
Hello.
just want to ask you that in the manuscript preparing process, basically we think that we research something and we write something. How does the difference between it? Because when I write something and I think something and the output ends with something else, right? So how this very thing differs in your thing?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
What I'm asking you probably
Writing
is...
goes in directions that you didn't intend.
Yeah, really.
My writing?
Yes.
Well, I write stories. I'm a storyteller. That's what I do. And if I'd written this story in 1989 when I first came across it, it would have been a different story. The fact that I wrote it in 2013 made it... I've tried to set Lawrence against the background of the coming war, because my research started with, I don't know if you remember, in summer of 2013, in Istanbul, there were the Gezi Park riots. That's where I started, and I ended up in Tahrir Square on the day that President Morsi fell. And in between, there were an awful lot of guns pointed at me. And that wouldn't have been the case if I'd made the journey say in the 90s. So yeah, it went in a slightly different direction in that the background is more violent than it might have been otherwise.
Gentleman in the front row.
Yeah, thank you, Eugene. My question is, when Lawrence promises the Nawaz or the Sharif of Makkah that he could possibly be the next caliph, there's also the simultaneous agreement between the foreign secretary and the Zionist leaders, the Balfour Agreement. So, did Lawrence had any honest intentions in delivering his promises, and is that the reason why he wanted to hide himself? Some kind of regrets that he betrayed his fellow Arab people.
Well, it wasn't Lawrence who promised independence to the Arabs. It was McMahon, and phrased in terms that weren't exactly clear. But yeah, there was certainly the British wanted the Arabs to understand that they would have independence afterwards, and at the same time they were doing a deal with the French. Now, Lawrence, remember, when he went into the Arab Revolt, was a junior liaison officer. He was not making policy. He was not in control of anything. And there was a great surprise that the Arabs emerged a fighting force. And the taking of Aqaba, suddenly the British in Cairo thought, hey, we can use these guys. And from that point on, I think Lawrence is being fooled into fooling the Arabs. And when he realizes what's happening, he says, it's a terrible thing you're asking me to do. I'm getting these people to fight on a lie. And from then on, he does continue, and he doesn't tell them, although 1917, The Guardian publishes the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and everybody knows about it. But they do carry on fighting, partly because the British are paying them so much to do it.
Please.
Yes, thanks very much, Eugene. I just want to ask very quickly, given the 7 pillars of wisdom that we've got, and I've trammeled hard, how important a work actually do you think it is? And I say this purely because I'm sure many people here despair at the way the West has even envisaged or even what it's done to the Middle East, and the West, how it never seems to learn lessons. Surely a lot of that was a prophecy long before anything that happened. I just wonder how important a work you think it is.
I think in terms of a personal record of what happened in the war, I think it's very important. And I think as a work of literature, it's very important. I mean, unfortunately, I find the style very, very archaic. But it was archaic when he wrote it. He was consciously mimicking Charles Doughty, who was already, difficult to read. But I urge you, if you want to go back to it, to try the audiobook, actually, because it flows quite well. And there's a lot of humor in it, which I didn't pick up when I was reading, that you do get from the audiobook.
Okay, I'll take that as an audio.
I have a question in the front row. And I've got 5 minutes by mine.
Yeah, we've got 4.
No, I'm not going to say anything more. Let's see if we can get 2 more in. So short and sharp, gentlemen, please. And if anybody else has a question, I want a hand.
Hi. Why do you think people are still fascinated and continue to write about him? It can't just be because the movie was so good.
Well, yeah, no, that's really interesting. I gave a talk in Edinburgh at the festival in August, and the head of the T.E. Lawrence Society came along, and that was the 4th time I'd spotted him in the audience of one of the talks I gave. So I went up to him afterwards and said, "What were you expecting? I was going to tell a different story." And he, what were you going to learn by coming? And he said, "I'm just fascinated that there's an audience for this, because he only meets the members of the society." He said, why are people still interested in this man? Because the view from within the T.E. Lawrence circle is that as the film disappears, that the people will lose interest in him. But there are more biographies about Lawrence than any other 20th century figure apart from Churchill. And and part of it is because of the mystique. Part of it that he died young and tragically, aged 40-something after a motorbike crash. And part of it because he was mythologizing later in life. Others were doing it for him as well. He was the first media star at the time. Hollywood was just emerging, and a film was made of him attacking by Lowell Thomas, of him attacking of the Arab Revolt. And during the early 1920s, millions of people in Britain, the US, and elsewhere saw this. And he became, he was a hero. He was, in fact, probably the only living hero who was still recognizable from the First World War on the Western side in the mid-20s. All the rest have been forgotten.
That's plenty of reason for fascination. We have 3 minutes left.
Okay.
I want the gentleman there, short and sharp.
Hi. If Lawrence were alive today, how easily do you think he would be able to navigate the Middle East with all the sectarian tensions and the conflict? How easily do you think?
The very old Lawrence.
Yeah, he'd say, "I told you so."
So we have to stop there. That is such a good ending. I promise you, in the course of this hour, we've only just scratched the surface. In no way have we spoiled the contents of this book. It is so engagingly written and so sympathetic to its subject without being adoring. You're not part of the I adore Lawrence crowd. That as a reader, I can encourage all of you as readers to go and get a copy of Young Lawrence. Thank you very much, Anthony. Thank you.
A big round of applause for Anthony Sattin, Eugene, for a lovely, brilliant session. Thank you so very much.
Ooh, I'm pinned.
हिंदी सिर्फ एक भाषा नहीं,